Welcome back for another deep dive. You know we love to get into the weeds, and today is no different. We're heading straight into UK politics, specifically that July 4th election and what it might mean for the UK's, shall we say, colorful relationship with the EU.
Yeah, and you know what's really interesting? We're working with a source that came out before the results were even in.
Oh, yeah, I remember you mentioning that. It's like watching a political thriller, knowing who wins, but having no clue how they got there.
Right. It's wild. So the source is an excerpt from a YouTube video with a very strange title, Revertir el Brexit.pdf, posted July 3rd, like right before.
So the day before the election, this person was making some pretty big predictions.
Oh, yeah, some bold ones. Like
Yeah.
one was that Labour might actually win and crush the Conservatives.
I mean, that would be a huge upset. I mean, why would Rishi Sunak, the prime minister, even call a snap election when things looked so bad for his party? And what could a Labour government even mean for Brexit? I mean, would they try to, like, reverse it?
There's a lot to unpack, but I think before we dive into the why,
Yeah.
we need to go back to December 2019.
Back to the last UK general election.
Right. Peak Brexit drama.
Ah, yes. Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party just swept into power with a majority in Parliament.
Exactly. They ran on that hard Brexit platform, promising to cut ties with the EU completely.
Right.
And, they did. The UK officially left, but things didn't really go as planned.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk about the UK thriving outside of the EU.
Right. But it hasn't been so smooth. I mean, the source material even points out a bunch of areas where things just haven't gone right. Like, for one thing, there have been huge labor shortages.
Makes sense. Industries that relied on workers from the EU, suddenly, they didn't have enough staff.
Yeah. Freedom of movement was a huge part of being in the EU, so.
Yeah.
And ironically, even though Brexit was supposed to help control the UK's borders, illegal immigration has actually increased since they left.
Oh, wow. What else has gone wrong?
Well, there's the ongoing instability in Northern Ireland.
Right.
The post-Brexit trade stuff has caused all sorts of problems there, political and economic. And then there are the economic struggles of the UK in general.
Right. The Bank of England itself has said that Brexit, along with other things like the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, have made those struggles worse.
Exactly. So it leads back to that question, why would Sunak call an early election in July when his party was facing all of that? Terrible poll numbers, Brexit fallout.
It just seems like such a risky move.
It was a gamble. The source suggests there were two main reasons behind it. The first being that he was worried the economic situation could just get worse and worse the longer he waited.
So cut his losses before they got even bigger.
Exactly. And second, he wanted to try and capitalize on some good economic news that had just come out, like inflation dropping.
Hoping for a little bit of good luck to turn the tide.
Pretty much. But it made people wonder if it would be enough to, convince voters who were already struggling. And speaking of risky moves, there's this funny story about the day he announced the election.
Oh, I love a good political anecdote. What happened?
So picture this, right? Sunak is standing outside 10 Downing Street, pouring rain, announcing the snap election.
Classic British weather.
Right. And as he's talking, some protester nearby starts blasting, "Things can only get better."
Isn't that the song Tony Blair used in his landslide victory back in '97?
Yep. The irony was not lost on anyone.
Sounds like a sign. But all jokes aside, calling an election like that was a big risk. What was Labour even doing in all of this? The political scene had completely changed since 2019.
Right. They were in a totally different position this time. I mean, they were ahead in the polls. A lot of people thought this was their chance to, undo some of the Brexit damage. But that's not quite how Labour played it.
So they didn't go all in on reversing Brexit.
No.
Yeah.
They actually barely even mentioned it. Like, it wasn't a main part of their campaign at all.
That's wild. Why do you think they did that?
Well, the source suggests that Keir Starmer, Labour's leader, knew that opening up that whole Brexit debate again would be so divisive.
Right. People were tired of arguing.
Exactly. So they focused on the future instead of the past, trying to appeal to everyone.
So not reversing Brexit, but not ignoring it either. How'd they manage that?
Okay, so Starmer, he basically drew three red lines when it came to Brexit. He said Labour would not go back to the EU single market, they would not go back to the customs union, and they would not allow free movement of people between the UK and EU.
So going back to the way things were before.
Right, which disappointed some people,
Mm-hmm.
but it showed the people who did vote for Brexit that Labour wasn't trying to undo their decision.
Smart move. So a balancing act. Acknowledge Brexit is here to stay, but the UK still needs to work with the EU. What did Labour see as potential areas of cooperation?
Well, Starmer saw room for improvement in defense, like a formal defense agreement with the EU, and Brussels actually liked that idea.
Right. I remember the conservatives prefer to play it by ear, especially when it came to the war in Ukraine.
Exactly.
Right.
Having an agreement would make things way more efficient and show a deeper commitment from the UK. But there wasn't really a clear picture of what that agreement would actually look like under Labour. Like, there were hints that it might involve economic and immigration stuff,
Yeah.
which the EU might not be so keen on.
So good intentions, but still room for disagreements. It's not just black and white, in or out.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
It's more like trying to find that middle ground,
Right.
recognizing Brexit happened, but trying to build a relationship with the EU that works.
Yeah, walking a tightrope.
Exactly. But before we get into the specifics of how Labour planned to do all that, let's look at some of the other issues that were at play.
Sounds good. What else was on Labour's agenda when it came to the EU?
Well, one big promise was to get rid of the Rwanda plan for asylum seekers.
Ah, yes, sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. Lots of controversy around that.
Yeah, Starmer called it inhumane and said he would strengthen border control in the UK instead.
That's a big change from the Conservatives.
It was a controversial move, for
Yeah.
sure. And this leads directly into another thing Labour wanted to improve with the EU trade.
Right, because even though the UK officially left the single market and customs union, trade with the EU is still a huge part of their economy.
Absolutely. And remember all those problems with trade after Brexit, especially food and agriculture stuff between Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Oh, yeah. Bureaucracy, delays, just a whole mess.
Total mess. So to try and fix that, Labour proposed a sanitary and phytosanitary agreement with the EU.
To refresh my memory, what exactly does that kind of agreement do?
It's basically a bunch of rules and standards for food and agricultural products that are traded between countries, to make sure everything is safe.
Okay, so basically less hassle at the border.
Yeah, in theory.
Yeah.
But there was a catch, of course. The EU would probably want the European Court of Justice to be involved in enforcing this agreement.
The ECJ, always a sensitive subject in the UK.
Always. For a lot of people, giving the ECJ any power at all is like a threat to their sovereignty. The Conservatives were totally against it. But Labour might have been more open to the idea.
Again, Labour trying to find that balance between good relations with the EU and not alienating Brexit voters.
Exactly. They were trying to find a way to make things work without just giving in. But even with all those potential issues, it was obvious that a Labour government would change the tone of UK-EU relations completely.
Yeah, we talked about that, moving past the anger and distrust.
Right, starting fresh, building trust. And you know what really showed that shift? The summit of the European political community that was scheduled just 2 weeks after the election.
Right. Hosted by the UK, Starmer would have been front and center.
Exactly. His chance to show his vision for, working with the EU.
Yeah.
But remember, we're talking about all this pre-election analysis. We don't actually know how it all turned out.
Right. Did they win? Were the predictions right? And if they did win, how did all those plans about the EU actually play out in the real world?
Those are the big questions. And we'll find out right after this.
Okay, so let's get to the results. Did Labour pull off the upset?
They did. Labour won big.
Yeah.
A landslide, really. They got 48.2% of the vote and like 146 more seats in Parliament.
Whoa, that's their biggest win since, 1945? The Conservatives really got hit hard.
Oh, yeah. Lost over half their seats, ended up with just 68, worst showing since the 1930s.
So a new era in British politics. Labour's back in power after 15 years. But what does this all mean for Brexit? Starmer had those 3 red lines during the campaign. No single market, no customs union, no free movement.
Right, and those haven't changed. Labour's made it clear they're not going to reverse Brexit. But they do want a better relationship with the EU.
Yeah.
Not easy, trying to move forward without getting stuck in all those old Brexit fights.
So where did they start? How did they try to, make this new cooperation happen?
Well, one of the first things they did was start talking to the EU about that defense agreement Starmer promised. Remember, he wanted something more formal than the Conservatives had, especially with the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, the Conservatives were more go with the flow, right? Which probably annoyed the EU.
Totally. A formal agreement would mean they could work together better, show the UK is really committed. And the talks, they seem to be going well. Both sides want to make it work.
So that defense agreement could actually happen. Big win for Starmer, especially so early on. But what about those other things we talked about, like the Rwanda plan and the whole trade mess with Northern Ireland?
Labour kept their promise, got rid of the Rwanda plan. Big win for human rights groups who, hated that policy.
I bet that didn't go over well with everyone, though, especially conservative voters who saw it as a way to stop illegal immigration.
Yeah, for sure. It was divisive. But it showed they were doing things differently than the conservatives. They wanted a more humane system. And with trade, Labour's been working with the EU trying to fix those Northern Ireland problems. Remember that sanitary and phytosanitary agreement?
Yeah.
Supposed to make trade easier.
Right. Cut through all the red tape. It sounded like a good idea, at least. But what about that sticky point, the whole thing about the European Court of Justice? Did that cause problems?
It did, like we thought it might.
Yeah.
That ECJ issue has been a big problem in the negotiations. The EU wants them involved in enforcing the agreement, but for a lot of people in the UK, that's a no-go. They see it as, like, giving up control.
So Starmer's in a tough spot, right? He wants things to be better with the EU, get trade moving, but he can't look like he's giving in to Brussels.
It's a balancing act. But what's interesting is Labour seems more willing to, consider a role for the ECJ than the Conservatives were.
So being more practical.
Yeah, I think so. Starmer wants solutions that work, even if it means compromising a bit. It's not that take it or leave it attitude we saw before.
So in a way, Brexit is making both sides be more flexible, work together, even if it means changing their minds about some things.
That's a good point. The UK seems more pragmatic now. They realize they need to work with Europe. But it's not just about policies. It's about the whole vibe between the UK and the EU. It's changed since Labour came in.
Yeah, we talked about that, moving past all the anger and blame.
Right. You can see it in how they talk to each other, more high-level meetings. Both sides are talking, even when things are tough.
Like they finally realized yelling across the English Channel wasn't working.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this new, friendlier approach, a lot of people like it. Businesses, regular people, they were tired of all the drama.
So things are looking up. But are there any bumps in the road? What could mess this up for Labor?
Well, it's still early, right? Labor's only been in charge for a few months. And even though everyone's getting along better, the reasons they had Brexit in the first place haven't gone away.
They still disagree on a lot of things.
Yeah.
Trade, immigration.
Right. And those differences are going to come up again, especially as they're still figuring out all the details of what happens after Brexit.
So even if everyone's trying to be nice, they could still end up fighting. What could set them off?
I think one thing that could be a problem is regulations. The EU wants to make sure UK businesses don't get an advantage by having lower standards.
So if the UK changes their rules too much, it could lead to, trade wars and stuff.
Exactly. So, yeah, everyone's talking about cooperation, being partners, but there's still a chance things could go wrong.
Like walking a tightrope.
Yeah, good way to put it. The UK and the EU, they're going to have to keep working on this, talking, compromising, changing as they go.
It's complicated, but, beyond the immediate stuff, like trade deals and politics, there's a bigger question.
Oh, what's that?
What's the UK's place in the world now after Brexit? It wasn't just about leaving the EU. It was about, who are they now? What's their role?
That's a big question, and we're still figuring that out. They're doing their own thing now, new trade deals, new alliances, trying to be a global player. But the world's a messy place.
So, what are the chances for the UK? What are the risks? And how does Labour's whole Brexit plan fit into that? We'll talk about all that after a quick break. All right, so the UK is trying to figure out its place in the world after Brexit. It's a big question. Lots of possibilities, but a lot of uncertainty too, right?
It is. It's like they have this chance to do things their own way now without the EU. But the world's, it's complicated. They can't just ignore everyone else.
Right. So how does Labour's whole Brexit strategy fit into that?
Well, they really want to work with other countries, especially on things like defense and security. They seem to get that they need those strong relationships with Europe.
So they want to be global Britain, but also a good European partner. Not an easy balance.
Not at all. And it'll be interesting to see how they actually do it. Like, take trade deals, for example.
Right. The UK can make their own deals now with anyone they want, but they don't want to mess things up with the EU, their biggest trading partner.
Exactly. They have to be smart about it. Don't want to make the EU mad while trying to make new friends.
Definitely a delicate situation. And it's not just trade, right? There's also the whole question of, what does the UK stand for in the world? Climate change, security, human rights, all that.
Right. Those are big issues that need everyone to work together. The UK can't just ignore them.
And Labour winning, that kind of shows people in the UK want to be involved in solving these problems, working with other countries.
Yeah, I think so. It's different from that us against the world kind of talk we heard before.
So maybe a change in how the UK deals with the rest of the world, not so much go it alone anymore.
It's possible,
Hmm,
but, foreign policy, it's never simple. There are so many things that affect it, not just who's in charge.
true. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. But British politics are definitely interesting these days. Oh, before I forget, you said something earlier about younger people in the UK, like how their views might be different and affect the whole EU thing.
Oh, right. So remember, older voters were the ones who mostly wanted Brexit. Well, younger people, the ones who grew up with the UK and the EU, they're much more pro-Europe.
They feel more like citizens of the world, like they care about traveling and working in other countries easily.
Yeah, exactly. And as they get older and start voting more, they're going to want closer ties with Europe.
Makes sense. If you've always been able to go anywhere in Europe, it's hard to imagine losing that. So even though Labour's not going to rejoin the EU, things could still change, right?
Yeah,
Become closer over time.
I think that could happen. It's a reminder that the whole Brexit thing, it's not over. It'll keep changing for years to come.
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job unpacking all of this today. From those early predictions to the election shocker and what it all means for the UK now.
It's definitely been fascinating to see how it's all unfolded. Hopefully our listeners have a better idea of what the UK is dealing with, the good and the bad.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. As always, check out the show notes for links to all the sources we talked about. Until next time, keep learning.